Hey everyone, welcome into Dom Time. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. A bit later in the show, I'll give you some of my thoughts on the horrific things that have happened today in Boston at the Boston Marathon. I ran there in 1978. It took up 4 hours, but I know that site very well, and there's a lot to say about that. But our attention tonight is on something that you wouldn't think is blowing up into a huge controversy. Recently, I interviewed a woman who wrote an editorial in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and had over 40,000 page views. Now, when that happens with a newspaper website in Pittsburgh, that gets my attention. She wrote that she was opting out of standardized tests. In Pennsylvania, they're called the PSSAs for her child for a variety of reasons, and she used, if you can imagine, a religious exemption allowed under Pennsylvania law. Joining us to talk about this in a bit is someone who's studied this, written 4 books about standardized testing. We'll talk with Richard Phelps in a moment, but first, joining me in studio tonight is Jesse Bacon. Jesse is a digital organizer for IDEA, the Institute for Democratic Education in America. Thanks for joining us, Jesse, in studio.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, a huge area of controversy, and from what I've been told, you're in the camp that supports some of this opting out.
I do. I mean, my fellowship with IDEA, we support democratic education in our schools, and this definitely seems like an example of both students and teachers who we work with, both groups, taking matters into their own hands. When you think about it, there's not much that's less accountable than a for-profit test company, and these testing is often determined at a state or national level, and it doesn't involve the wishes of the people on the ground. And what's more, I think that you're really getting, I mean, I'm not someone who's in the classroom, but I think that the folks who are really sending us a clear message.
Well, I would say I'm someone who was in the classroom, and I would ask you then, what the heck, when you talk about democracy, I believe our public schools are essentially a failure in many ways nationwide. We could point fingers of blame all over the place, which we're not here to do. How do we detect the schools and procedures that are working, though, versus those that are not, unless we have some test that is across the board?
Well, when you think about it, when was the last time you knew something or learned something from reading a test report or a Scantron? What we really
many times when I was teaching. Sure, you could tell where a kid was weak in math would be the easiest one that I would point to.
Yeah, and I think that's the historic role of standardized tests, is to diagnose areas where a student might need a little bit of help, and that's to me, that's an appropriate role. But when you really want to know what's working in schools, you really have to spend time in them. And that's why the project I'm most proud of with IDEA is A Year at Mission Hill. It's ayearatmissionhill.com. And that's a school actually in Boston where
What would you do, though? You would just get rid of the testing. How would we know where kids fall across the line and how well teachers are doing as one part of their evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, and often that'll be said, it'll say, well, it's not 100% of the evaluation, but the fact is, if you have standardized tests as 40% of the evaluation, it gets a kind of plurality, and everything else is broken up into these littler segments. Standardized tests carries the greater weight. And I think it's a great question. How do we know as a nation our schools are working? I think often the failure of our schools is overstated, and we need to, and at the same time, you know, we want the best possible schools. So I think we need to look at these positive examples. We do need to use data, but the data that is being collected, for one thing, these tests, the purpose of the tests is so that some students will fail them and some schools will fail them. And that unequal playing field creates the results.
Okay,
and that's
well, let's bring in Richard Phelps. Richard Phelps is someone who has written 4 books on testing and has done a tremendous amount of research in this. Richard, do you share what our guest in studio has just said about why we're doing these standardized tests, the PSSAs and others? Each state may have their own tests.
Well, no, not altogether. As I understand it, the PSSA has no stakes for the students, and I'm bewildered as to why a parent would pull a student out of class on test day.
Well, let me underline that so we don't lose that in a thread here. I know that what Richard Phelps is concerned about, and I saw this when I was teaching, that students, I've seen students play games, connect the dots, do all kinds of things, and there's no pressure on the student. There's nothing that can be done, apparently.
Right, and I think that's probably the major drawback of the No Child Left Behind series of tests. There's the pressure is on the schools because they can be closed if they don't meet their targets, and indirectly on teachers because they work at the school.
All right, well,
But
let me bring you to the premise.
not
Can
on
you
the
defend the
students, and
idea,
that's-
Richard, can you defend the idea that we need to use standardized tests, that there's nothing else we can do
Absolutely.
that's quite as good as this?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's not the only form of evaluation, and I would agree that there's no substitute for being on the ground and being at a school. You can tell a lot just by being there and soaking up the atmosphere. But there's no real replacement for standardized testing either. It's unique in many characteristics and gives you information you can't get any other way.
Like what information would you say that a standardized test, you heard Jesse's objections, what would you say it gives us that we can't get in other ways?
Well, for your example, where you would learn something from the test results, you can learn that some students are not getting certain concepts, and you're not gonna learn that unless you test a lot, either in the classroom or via standardized tests. And the standardized tests provide the information outside the classroom to parents, to school administrators, and to the rest of the public.
What's your notion, though, of the sense we hear phrases high-stakes testing? We have people saying it's their religious right to opt out of this. What about using this so that we measure how well a school is doing?
Well, right. As I understand it, there are no high stakes on the students with the PSSA. There are with the Keystone exams.
Right.
But I think stakes it's one factor that helps to increase student achievement. I did a study. It took me about 10 years on my own time. I reviewed over 3,000 studies on the effect of testing on student achievement over the past 100 years. And the strongest variable that increases student achievement with testing is feedback. Two forms of feedback: students just knowing how they're doing, and then intervention types of feedback like remediation. But stakes has an effect too. It has a very strong positive effect. So students are more motivated when there are stakes, and that's a benefit.
All right. Well, Richard, thank you. Thanks for joining us tonight here in Dime Time. Appreciate the expertise. Coming up, we'll talk with Jesse a little bit more, and we're going to talk with a Penn State professor who I would say, in my view, is among the leaders of those that are helping to use even religious reasons. We'll find out, does any religion really, I'm a Catholic, does any religion really teach you that you don't have to take standardized tests? That's straight ahead on Dime Time.